Hey, good morning, Forrest. How you doing? Here we
Lonnie, good
are.
morning. How's it going this morning?
Really good, really good. So, real estate in real time, episode number 2. Are you excited?
Yeah, I'm excited. And you're down in South Carolina, and I'm right here at the Salisbury Center. Thank you so much, John Caniford, Jeff Salisbury, for providing this beautiful studio for us to do our podcast.
Yeah, we appreciate you guys, and thanks for allowing me to stream in virtually. This is great. But we're going to start off today talking a little bit about there was a CNN article earlier this week. Biggest shakeup in a century set to hit real estate agents this week and how they're preparing. Did you see the article for us?
I saw the article. It came out yesterday. I think we should talk about it. Last podcast, we promised that we'd dive a little bit deeper into what's going on with this lawsuit. And I think it's pretty simple, but it seems to still be confusing. And I think it boils down to leadership and setting expectations for the agents and how they're going to do their business here in the future. So I know that there was a quote here from CEO of EXP Realty, a big real estate company. And he said, "This is the grand social experiment in an industry at scale." And this is the part I don't like. Even though I really like Leo, think he's a great guy, he says, "I'm bracing my agents for what I call the messy middle. I fully expect a lot of confusion." You know something? I just don't see it as confusing, Lonnie.
Yeah, I don't see it as confusing either. And, we in South Carolina, well, at least in the Charleston area, the compensation was removed from the MLS fields on August 5th, and then in Myrtle Beach yesterday. And, some of the calls that I've taken from other brokers and other agents, they are confused. And part of the confusion is they haven't really taken the time to process, what needs to happen in this new environment. And once I explained it to them, I had several conversations, a little disturbing that people didn't know, but once I explained to them what the process was, they were fine. And they were like, oh, that makes total sense. But I think, we have not been, as an industry, talking to our agents enough and talking to our consumers enough about what this process looks like.
And I think with leadership, I mean, let's face it, in the real estate world, leaders don't want to upset their real estate agents. Real estate agents are independent contractors. They are not employees. So they don't want to tip the apple cart, shall we say. So I think their messaging, especially in a time like this, you have to be a leader, you have to be a strong leader, and you have to break things down and set expectations. And I think the National Association of Realtors, our president, did a good job. It did a good job with that. He had a statement as well, and that's Kevin Sears. He said, "These changes help to further empower consumers with the clarity and choice when buying and selling a home." He says, "I'm confident in our membership's ability to prepare for and embrace this evolution of our industry and help to guide consumers in this new landscape." And I think that's leadership. I think it's let's embrace this and let's figure out how to move forward, because it really comes down to just two things. Real estate brokers shouldn't share commissions. That's first thing.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this last week too, right? The DOJ in their recommendations basically are saying we need to decouple the two sides of the transaction, right? We do not any longer need to share commissions, and there are processes in place and mechanisms available so that doesn't need to happen in the future. And that's where we're going anyways. So why not try to practice that today?
Yeah, in a real estate transaction, there's basically three contracts. The first contract that's entered into is a contract with the owner of a property, When you list a property, there's a listing agreement. And that listing agreement is a contract between the brokerage company and the seller of that property. So in that agreement, you simply put what you're willing to market the property for, the amount of money that you're willing to consider, and the sellers were willing to consider paying you. You agree on that amount of money, whether it's a percentage or an amount of money, and then you have that contract to do those things. That's the listing agreement.
Absolutely. And very simple. You meet with the seller, you explain to the seller, hey, these are the things I'm going to do for you. This is what my brokerage firm charges. Now let's talk about maybe some concessions, that you're willing to pay on behalf of the buyer. Let's talk about, if you do have a buyer broker representing the buyer coming in, what are you willing to pay them? And then talk about the advantages of the person on the other side of the transaction actually having a professional buyer broker represent them, right? There are a lot of opportunities for, that person to help that deal run a lot smoother than it otherwise would, right? So there are definite advantages in having a professional on the other side. We've just got to talk through with our seller all of those options at the time of the listing appointment.
Right. And a lot of it, it's like if you offer the same compensation in a company, like all size, it fits all. It's just same size fits all. It's why offer exactly the same compensation as if every listing in every market in every area is exactly the same. That's not the way to move forward. The way to move forward is to meet with a client, look at the market, tell them their chance of selling if they do not offer a compensation, and then move from that point. I know it really depends on the market. When we were in a buyer's market, you would always want to offer compensation or your property absolutely was not going to be seen. There was so much supply and not a lot of demand. There were even folks offering agent bonuses. There were folks offering to pay closing costs up front. Anything the seller could do to draw the attention of that buyer, to move that buyer into looking at that home and considering the home. So you do what you need to do individually, and you take every situation and you separate it and you say, in your situation, and the likelihood of your home selling, let's try to figure out who that buyer is going to be, where they're going to come from, and what we need to do to sell your home.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember those days, there were cruises, there were cars, trips, all kinds of things being offered out there. So this is not unusual. So the current environment that we're in, or where we're moving with this after August 17th, depending upon where you're at, it's the market is going to tell us, right, what's going to be offered. The market, is it a buyer's market? Is it a seller's market? What's a buyer willing to pay, and how do we incentivize that buyer to be able to move forward on that purchase?
Yeah, I remember when they said the Mercedes in the garage goes with the house.
Literally, Mercedes in the
I'm
garage.
telling you, and that is the realistic situation we were in the 90s. And then we have the next contract. The next contract is a contract that has always been mandated in the state of Virginia. And that is the buyer agency contract. And that's a contract between a buyer, someone that is going to buy a property, and the real estate brokerage company that represents them. It's a buyer agency agreement. And that's always been needed, but now it's going to be mandated on a federal level, but it's always been mandated in the state of Virginia.
Yeah, always been mandated, but not necessarily discussed with a buyer until time of contract. And now it needs to be discussed with a buyer, in both South Carolina and Virginia. It needs to be discussed before a property is shown, which is a little different, discussed and agreed to at that point in time. It's just it's not that different than the way we've been practicing, right? It's just having those conversations with the client, with the customer up front. And it seems like that's where the agents are having a little bit of difficulty figuring out, because it is a little different and almost being afraid of the response of the client. I'm telling you, the client is going to be grateful that you're transparent. They understand the entire process up front. And then there are no surprises once you get down the road.
All right. In a listing agreement, you have the agreement between the owner of the property and the brokerage representing them. Buyer's agreement, you have an agreement between the buyer and the brokerage company representing them. And then you have the actual contract offer, which is now not an offer from the brokerage company or involving the brokerage company. That offer is between the parties. That is an offer between the buyer and the seller. And that's the contract offer, which is the third contract that we're speaking about today. And in that offer, a buyer is going to present in their original offer everything that they wish to have. And it's going to involve the house. So it'll have a description of the house, how much they're willing to pay. And then they have obligations. They're going to have an obligation. They have to put down payment down. Well, they have to pay their own down payment. Now, if you're a VA buyer, thank you for serving our country, and you can go $0 down. And there's different programs out there. And the second part of the money that they have to pay is their closing costs. Now, with different loan programs, they can ask the seller to pay their closing costs. Even though it's the buyer's obligation, they can ask the seller to pay it. And then they have their contract, their agreement between themselves and the agent or their brokerage company representing them. The buyer agency agreement. That is an obligation that the buyer has. The buyer can ask the seller to pay that obligation. So as the seller is evaluating the contract and they're looking at the offer price, what the contingencies are, inspections, the settlement date, any other concession that the buyer is willing to make to the seller, they may also be asking for the seller to consider paying obligations that are obligations of the buyer so the buyer can buy their home.
Sure, it's just part of the overall negotiation process, right? And I'm going to throw out some examples, some phone calls that I received this week that, were a little disturbing from both agents and brokers. And I just want to say, I'm so proud of my agents here at Next Tony Agency Group. We have been talking about this lawsuit for a year now. We've been following, the settlement, what's required with the settlement. We have been going over talking points for the last, couple months, and they got it. They understand how this process should work, right? Some of the phone calls I've been receiving, involve, hey, I have an offer for your property, but unless you sign a compensation agreement, I'm not sending over the offer. Crazy stuff like that. Also, one agent said, my broker mandates that if I don't have a compensation agreement signed, I can't show the property. Now, I know that's not the case because there's no broker in their right mind who's going to say, if you don't have a compensation agreement signed, you can't show the property. I mean, these are some of the things we're going to be facing over the next, weeks and months. And I just really want to encourage the agent population out there and the brokers out there to really understand this process and make sure that your people are well trained so that we can do exactly what we're supposed to do, right? Which is create transparency and build trust with the clients, with the consumer, right?
Absolutely. And we have, and so the two things that we were talking about, the two simple changes. Real estate brokerage companies shouldn't share commissions. Simple enough. Yeah. Simple enough. Mm-hmm. They all have their own contract with their party. And each party is paid by the party that hired them. So if the buyer hires a brokerage company, the buyer pays them. It makes sense. In every other thing that we buy in life, that's how it works. And if the seller hires somebody, they pay them. The parties themselves can ask things of each other. I mean, when a buyer says in a very strong seller's market, I'm going to let you live in the house for free after I own it. That is a buyer's concession to a seller. Does that represent money? Absolutely, it represents money. They now have a loan that they're paying on, or they have their cash that they paid into this property. They own the property, and they're now conceding to allow the seller to live in that property, the property that they own for a period of time until the agreed upon time where the seller moves out. So these concessions are not just made by the seller. It depends on the market. And we are currently in a seller's market. We have been in a very strong seller's market. Hasn't always been that way. When supply and demand was different, there was a greater amount of supply, not a whole lot of demand. We were in a buyer's market, and the buyer was in the driver's seat. And that was a very strong buyer's market from 1990 to 1999 spring. So those are the two things that we're really talking about. So to me, it's not confusing. We just have to lead through it and help people to understand it.
I agree. And it's going to be fine. We talked about in episode 1 about, perhaps 40 to 50% of the agent population leaving the business, which is totally possible. I mean, I think having 1.5 million realtors is probably a little much in considering, the amount of homes that are sold every year. So, it's an adjustment, right? It's an adjustment within our industry, but I think we're going to be better because of it. And we're going to be able to move forward with more transparency. And like we talked about the other day, we're moving into a new world, right? It is consumer centric. So for agents who are going to say, listen, if I can't make X number of dollars by showing your property, I'm not going to show your property. I just want to say to you, it's not about you. It's not about us. It's about protecting the consumer, creating transparency for the consumer, making them understand how valuable we are as a real estate professional.
Yeah, I've heard agents for now almost 35 years saying that they provide the best service. They're number one. They're there 24/7 for their clients, and it's not about the money. It's about taking care of people. Well, when this shakeup happens and things are extremely simple and it becomes all about the money for the agent to receive, then everything that they previously said kind of washes out. So it's about it's the agent taking care of the customer. And fiduciary in real estate, we have fiduciary is our responsibility to take care of our client. We have fiduciary responsibility. And the National Association of Realtors gave it an acronym, Old Car, Lonnie.
Yeah, tell us about that. Well, what is Old Car?
What they wanted to do is they wanted agents to have something to be able to focus on so that when they were dealing with the clients, they could continue to remember what their allegiance is to be to that client. And it's obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care of diligence. So when you're thinking that is indeed my responsibility when I sign up with someone, when I sign a contract to act in this manner for my client, then if the conversation is directed about me, how am I going to get paid? How are we going to work this into the deal? How are we going to get somebody else to do it? And the good news is to me, with the buyer saying, something, we're going to figure out a workaround here so you don't have to pay the obligation that you're supposed to pay. We're going to have somebody else pay it. Is that really fiduciary?
Yeah. And just to be clear here, the moment that you sit down with a buyer and you sign and they sign a buyer agency agreement, right? There's a contract. At that moment, you have a fiduciary responsibility to that buyer. When you go on a listing appointment, the seller signs a listing agreement, the broker signs a listing agreement. At that moment, you have fiduciary responsibility to that seller. And I think agents aren't taking that seriously. They're not understanding exactly what that means moving forward. Yes, you're going to do everything that you can, right, to make sure that you're minimizing the cost of the transaction. If that's what the buyer's asking you to do, you're going to do everything you can to do that, but you're not going to try to manipulate the transaction for your own benefit.
And the self-serving portion of it comes with these glaringly obvious with these workarounds. I call the first one secret agent codes. Lonnie, these secret codes, it's crazy. It's like, in wartime, we have some of the smartest people in the United States figuring out codes being sent from the enemy and deciphering those to know if a place is going to be attacked, who's in jeopardy, our soldiers, and the agents are coming up with these codes like we're not going to figure it out, or the industry isn't going to figure it out, or the Department of Justice or their state law isn't going to figure it out. So these secret codes to work around, and the secret codes involve, how am I going to let you know is the buyer's agent that I'm not supposed to, I know that I'm not supposed to communicate it in the Bright MLS, but how am I going to let you know I'm willing to pay, or the seller's willing to pay a commission? Just don't do it. The secret codes.
Yeah. And if you have a buyer agency agreement, you have a buyer who has agreed to pay you, right? Why are you worried about it? If you have a fiduciary responsibility to that buyer and they're looking for a specific property in a specific place for a specific price, they're looking for a property, you have an obligation. If you know about those properties, you have an obligation to not only share those with your buyer, but to make those an option for your buyer. Show your buyer those properties. And there's a negotiation process that will happen at the time of the offer, and you're going to negotiate whether or not the seller is going to contribute to the buyer broker commission or to concessions or whatever. It's just part of the process. And we've just got to understand that there's no guaranteed anything at the end of the transaction, right? Not like it used to be. And I think I used, somebody was giving me a hard time about using the Cousin Vinny reference on the last podcast. But it's so true. We have so many agents that are just kind of hanging around, waiting to be procuring calls and be able to cash in on whatever the commission offered on the MLS was. That's going away. I do feel like most agents want to do the right thing. They really do. But unfortunately, they haven't spent the time necessary to figure out what the right thing is, right? They haven't educated themselves as to this new process and this new way of doing business. Because every agent and broker that I've talked to who have, initially been very defensive, once I explain the process to them, they're like, oh, that makes total sense. I get it now. So I think, as leaders in the industry, we have a responsibility to make sure our agents and our organizations are understanding what needs to happen moving forward. And I think that's our opportunity.
Yeah, and the complexities of a real estate transaction, the more information that's out there, the more that's available, the more opinions out there is how it's just so complex. We believe every buyer and every seller needs a realtor, needs a real estate professional. We believe to get through a transaction, It takes having somebody that can navigate that transaction. These folks are experts in their industry. They're experts with the procedure of buying real estate, how it relates to their state. That's how realtors are. We believe they're absolutely necessary. We know even with this massive information that we have, the stats are still 9 in 10 buyers want to and use a real estate agent. And the same thing with sellers. They want to and they use a real estate agent. They believe it's absolutely necessary. So this isn't about the value of a client needing to use a real estate agent. We know that it's there. We know how important it is. And the more information out there, the more complex it is, the more they need a real estate professional. Now it's just talking about who the loyalty is with the real estate professional through the contract and how they're going to be compensated.
Yeah, and moving forward, in this new way of doing business, and taking advantage of the opportunities to create trust with the clients, right? So not only are we going to be able to service those buyers and service those sellers, we are going to be able to basically improve our industry reputations, right? Because we're being transparent with them through the entire process and the entire transaction. And we're going to be able, the group of agents that are, adamant about doing this the right way, they're going to have more business. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. They're going to have more business. The bigger the shakeup, the bigger the opportunity is for excellent agents and excellent leadership to lead and provide direction. And if leaders are talking about confusion amongst agents, and agents are actually articulating to clients and customers, then it's mass confusion. You focus on confusion, you get confusion. You focus on problem solving, you solve problems. That's what leaders do. So Lonnie, the agency group, we understand the changes in the market. We've understood the changes in the market. And thanks to leadership with James Wiggins and Next Home. And so this is how we're doing our business, and we will continue to do our business. Tell them, Lonnie, how would a Next Home agency group agent handle that listing appointment?
Absolutely. As a Next Home agency group agent, at the listing appointment with the seller, we're going to provide and discuss, number one, the marketing plan, right? Secondly, we're going to discuss comparable properties, active, under contract, sold, based on the current market. We're going to talk about market conditions, things like that. We're going to list the home for our fee, and the fee gets set by the brokerage. It's totally negotiable, but we have a standard listing fee for handling the listing side of the transaction. We will also discuss the process to be followed when the listing agent communicates with interested parties. So we're going to talk to when we discuss with buyer brokers who are showing the property, they're going to ask us the question, is your seller willing to compensate a buyer broker? Is your seller willing to pay concessions? Well, we're going to find out from our sellers at that appointment what we are allowed to disclose. Are we just disclosing that we are, are we just disclosing that the seller is willing and you have to bring an offer, or are we disclosing a certain percentage that the seller is willing? And what the seller tells us is what we're going to do. Also, the seller will entertain offers for their property to include any requested buyer concessions, which we talked about. And we're going to encourage the buyer broker to bring an offer and put any concessions, any buyer broker compensation assistance should be included in the actual offer. And that's how we're going to handle it moving forward for us.
No, I think that's awesome. And it's like any other interview. So when we communicate, let's just say that our seller says, hey, we will pay up to a certain amount of commission. And I want you to tell that to folks, to buyers. And the conversation very well may be, with interested parties that the seller has agreed to pay up to a certain percentage or a certain amount for buyer agency compensation on behalf of the buyer's agent. But we want to see a resume. We want to see the qualifications of that buyer agent. So depending on the likelihood of getting that deal to settlement, the seller may pay none of it, or the seller may pay up to all of it, because the reality is a buyer wants to buy a property and get the settlement, and a seller wants to sell a property and move on with their life.
Absolutely. And, this gives the seller the opportunity to actually see the totality of the transaction, right? And to see what the bottom line is going to be. And there are other terms that, like you said earlier, that are valuable, right? And worth money, whether it's a pre-occupancy, a post-occupancy, whatever, settlement date, who, earnest money. I mean, there are a lot of terms and conditions in a contract or in an offer. So all of those will be considered at the time the offer is presented to the seller.
Well, that's awesome, Lonnie. That is going to be RE in real time. That's going to be a wrap for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And next week, Lonnie, we're going to talk about third-party limited authority. This is a huge, huge value that agents have. And if you don't know you have it, stay tuned next week. We're going to tell you all about it.